You fined me for fixing my driveway, said it didn't match the neighborhood. What they didn't know, I used to build roads for the military. This wasn't about gravel, it became a showdown. Stay until the end, the final reveal will make the whole HOA rethink who they messed with. Welcome to HOA Justice Real Stories, the place where truth hits harder than rules. We'll continue the story soon. But first, tell me, which country are you watching this from? Comment below, I want to see how far this story travels. The first letter arrived on a warm Thursday morning, tucked neatly inside the community mailbox like it carried some grand decree. A bright white envelope with the HOA's bold blue logo. The kind of mail that made your stomach tighten before you even tore it open. Inside was a single page, short, direct, and condescending. The Homeowners Association had fined me for unauthorized property alterations. Specifically, for adding a layer of gravel to my driveway. A $250 penalty, payable within 14 days, or further action would be taken. I remember standing at the edge of that same driveway, looking down at the crushed limestone shimmering under the morning light. It wasn't just gravel, it was structure, drainage, precision. Every inch of it laid with military accuracy. I had spent hours compacting, grading, ensuring perfect slope and runoff. To me, this was basic engineering. But to them, it was rebellion. The neighborhood had always been the type where everyone peeked over their fences just to make sure your grass was the right shade of green. The kind where lawn height was practically a religion, and mailbox colors had their own commandments. But even among those unwritten rules, the HOA reigned supreme. They believed they kept order. I believed they killed individuality. For months, I had ignored the growing cracks in my old asphalt driveway, a legacy from the previous owner, patched too many times to survive another winter. When spring came, I decided to fix it myself. Not for vanity, but for necessity. The rains had turned it into a shallow lake. I didn't call a contractor. I didn't need one. For 27 years, I had served in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, building roads through jungles, deserts, and disaster zones. I'd managed construction that survived tanks, floods, and monsoons. So a suburban driveway was hardly a challenge. The HOA's problem wasn't that I did the job wrong. It was that I did it without their permission. That's what the letter said in careful bureaucratic language: failure to submit a modification request. They weren't angry about the gravel, they were angry I didn't kneel first. That evening, I stood watching cars roll past my house, the same neighbors who nodded politely but whispered the moment I turned away. The neighborhood grapevine had already spread the word: he's been fined. Some smiled in quiet satisfaction, others just stayed out of it. The HOA thrived on conformity, and my driveway had become a public act of defiance. I could have paid the fine, submitted an apology, maybe even redone the driveway in the HOA-approved material. But something about the tone of that letter, that smug, stamped arrogance, dug into me deeper than the gravel under my boots. That night, I sat at my old drafting desk, surrounded by yellowed blueprints from my army days. Projects I'd led overseas. Runways, bridges, and supply roads. Each one built to withstand more than any suburban storm could throw. I flipped through them, remembering the long nights under floodlights, the hum of machinery, the satisfaction of solid ground under my feet. I thought about the irony, that after decades of serving my country building infrastructure, I was now being punished for fixing a 10-foot stretch of ground in front of my own home. The HOA saw gravel. I saw integrity. I decided not to respond. Not yet. I wanted to see how far they'd push. 2 weeks later, the second letter came. This one wasn't polite. Failure to comply may result in escalating fines and legal enforcement. The language was sharper now, more threatening. They demanded I restore the property to its prior condition or face daily penalties. I looked at my driveway again. Still perfect. Still even. Still draining rainwater exactly where it should. It wasn't about the work, it was about control. Neighbors began stopping by, pretending to make small talk, fishing for gossip. Some were quietly supportive, whispering that the HOA had gone too far. Others acted as if my gravel might infect their lawns. One even told me that the neighborhood aesthetic had standards, as if crushed rock was contagious. By the third week, the HOA president herself started driving by, slowing down just enough to glare. Her car, a spotless white SUV, passed my house twice a day like a patrol vehicle. It was absurd, but predictable. Power, no matter how small, always needs to be exercised. The thing about being in the military is that you learn to read escalation patterns. You know when a simple order turns into a campaign. The HOA was gearing up for one. I could see it coming. So I prepared my counterattack, not with anger, but with precision. I began pulling out old military documents, construction permits, and civil code references. If they wanted a battle in paperwork, I'd fight it in their own language. I spent nights researching municipal zoning laws and HOA bylaws. And what I found was gold. The HOA had overstepped. Their own rules allowed for temporary gravel surfacing during maintenance or repair of existing driveways. My work qualified perfectly. They just didn't expect anyone to read the fine print. By the end of that week, I had assembled a binder, a dossier, really, with every photograph, measurement, and clause I could find. I wasn't going to fight this emotionally. I was going to fight it professionally. But I knew the HOA wouldn't just back off. They'd double down. That's what people do when they're afraid to lose control. And I was ready for it. Because this wasn't about a driveway anymore. It was about principle. As I closed the binder and set it on the kitchen table, a knock came at the door. Slow, deliberate, and familiar. Through the frosted glass, I saw a silhouette, clipboard in hand, wearing that confident HOA badge. The war had officially begun. The morning of the inspection arrived without warning, though I'd known it was coming. The HOA didn't schedule their visits, they descended. The neighborhood woke to a strange calm that day, the kind of silence that hides behind curtains. Even the birds seemed to sense the tension. At 9:07 a.m., a white SUV rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac, the same spotless vehicle that had been circling my house for a week. Behind it followed two sedans, both carrying the HOA's self-appointed compliance officers. They stepped out in unison, clipboards in hand, sunglasses on, and expressions that tried too hard to look professional. From my porch, I watched as they stood at the foot of my driveway, staring at the gravel like they had discovered a crime scene. They whispered to each other, pointing, jotting notes. To them, this wasn't stone and drainage, it was rebellion laid bare. They didn't realize I'd already prepared everything. Hidden cameras on my porch recorded every step, every gesture. If this was going to be a battle, I wanted a record of every move. I had spent the previous night rehearsing the sequence in my mind, how they'd look for anything to condemn. The HOA never arrived to inspect, they arrived to accuse. They didn't check for safety or structure, only conformity. I could almost predict their checklist: color not matching community palette. Material inconsistent with neighborhood standards. Slope alteration affecting aesthetics. They spoke the language of control disguised as order. The head of the trio was Mrs. Aldridge, the HOA president herself. Her posture was rigid, her voice sharp even from a distance. She was the type who treated bylaws as scripture and her clipboard as gospel. The others followed her lead, moving in calculated silence, scanning every inch of my property. I didn't interrupt. Not yet. I let them finish their slow parade, their murmured judgments, their exaggerated note-taking. When they finally looked toward the house, I was already standing by the steps, calm, steady, silent. The morning sun framed everything like a courtroom. The gravel shimmered. Their shoes crunched over it, leaving shallow impressions. To them, that sound, that crunch, was defiance. I didn't speak. There were no words needed. Their eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, I could see it: uncertainty. They expected confrontation, maybe apology. Instead, they met stillness. They retreated to the sidewalk, whispering again, flipping through their pages. The inspection, as they called it, lasted 13 minutes. But those 13 minutes changed everything. By afternoon, I knew they would file their report, and they did. It arrived the next day via email, a 5-page document accusing me of unauthorized modifications to the structural appearance of the property. They cited page after page of community codes, twisting vague language into weapons. But what they didn't know was that I had already studied those same codes more thoroughly than they ever had. Their own rules protected me. Section 4, Paragraph B, temporary surfacing during repair or maintenance, exactly what I had done. And even better, Section 9.2 stated that any enforcement action must include documented evidence of community impact or hazard. They had none. Still, they escalated. Within 3 days, I received another letter. This one wasn't just a fine, it was a notice of mandatory restoration. They demanded that I remove the gravel and restore the previous asphalt surface within 10 days or face a $500 daily fine. $500 per day. For fixing my own driveway. That was the moment the quiet amusement inside me hardened into resolve. They weren't after compliance, they were after submission. And I wasn't going to give it to them. For the next 2 nights, I compiled everything: photos, timestamps, maintenance permits, even old invoices showing the crumbling state of the original asphalt. I drafted a response letter, formal and detailed, referencing their own clauses one by one. It wasn't angry, it was precise, professional, unshakable. And at the end of that letter, I included something extra: my credentials. Retired engineer, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Specialist in road and infrastructure construction. project lead on over 40 military-grade construction operations across 5 countries. I attached scanned copies of certificates, official commendations, and my last Department of Defense ID. Nothing boastful, just undeniable proof of expertise. If they wanted to question my driveway, they'd have to question the same man who built roads that survived artillery. I printed 3 copies of the document, one for the HOA board, one for the community management office, and one for myself. The next morning, I hand-delivered it. No email. No hesitation. Paper carries weight, and I wanted them to feel it. The office clerk, a young man with nervous energy, looked stunned as I slid the folder across the counter. He asked if he should forward it to the compliance chair. I told him no need, I'd already sent copies to the city's public works department for reference. That made him pause. By evening, whispers spread. Word travels fast in neighborhoods ruled by gossip. They said I'd threatened legal action. I hadn't. I'd only cited the truth. But the HOA thrived on rumor, and rumor was their weakness. 2 days later, the board called an emergency meeting. They didn't invite me, but I knew. Cars lined up near the clubhouse late into the evening. Inside, the same people who once waved politely were now arguing about bylaws, procedures, and liability. They didn't realize I had allies now. A few residents, tired of the HOA's arrogance, began quietly reaching out. They'd been fined for flower pots, shed colors, even kids' basketball hoops. My situation became a symbol, a line in the gravel. The inspection that was meant to shame me had backfired. Instead, it exposed them. Their overreach, their obsession, their fear of losing control. Still, I knew the war wasn't over. HOAs rarely admit defeat, they simply change tactics. And sure enough, by the end of the week, I received one more letter. This one was shorter, but far more dangerous. It stated that a special board review would be held regarding my continued non-compliance and disrespect for association authority. That phrasing, disrespect for authority, told me everything I needed to know. They were no longer fighting for the rules. They were fighting for their pride. I stood by my window that night, looking down at the same driveway that had started it all. The gravel glowed faintly under the porch light, steady and unbothered. To me, it wasn't just stone anymore. It was defiance made visible. The inspection had failed to scare me. But it had succeeded in something else, it had awakened the soldier in me. The one who didn't back down from organized power. Because this wasn't just about property anymore. This was about principle. And the next chapter, the board meeting, was where the real battle would begin. The night before the board meeting, the neighborhood slept under an uneasy silence. A kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but waiting. The streetlights hummed faintly, throwing thin shadows across the gravel of my driveway. The same gravel that had turned a quiet cul-de-sac into a battlefield of pride and paperwork. Inside, my binder sat open on the kitchen table, a thick, heavy volume of every document, every photograph, every line of code the HOA had ever written and broken. To me, this wasn't a meeting anymore. It was an operation. And I had planned operations all my life. The invitation to the meeting, though they called it a mandatory review, was nothing short of intimidation. The letter had been formal, sterile, and laced with arrogance. Failure to attend will result in escalation of enforcement. That was their way of saying, show up and submit. But I had no plans of submitting. Morning came gray and cold. Clouds hung low over the rooftops, casting a dull, muted tone over everything. The HOA clubhouse stood at the end of the street, a small brick building with an oversized flagpole and a manicured hedge that spelled out, Community First. The irony almost made me laugh. By the time I arrived, 5 cars already filled the parking lot. Inside, I could hear the faint rustle of papers, the clinking of coffee mugs, and the occasional throat clearing, the sound of bureaucratic self-importance. I walked in quietly, my folder under one arm. The board sat behind a long folding table, 7 members in total, each with their own stack of files. At the center was Mrs. Aldridge, the president. Her expression was one of smug composure, the kind you wear when you believe the outcome is already written. Chairs were lined up in neat rows for observers. A few residents had shown up, curiosity written across their faces. They didn't know if they were about to watch a hearing or a spectacle. I took a seat near the front, not saying a word. The meeting started with the usual formalities, roll call, minutes, motions. Then, like a practiced ritual, they turned to my case. Mrs. Aldridge cleared her throat and began reading from a printed statement. She spoke of non-compliance, community standards, and unapproved materials. Her tone was deliberate, her words rehearsed. She talked about maintaining neighborhood harmony and preventing structural inconsistencies. To anyone else, it might have sounded reasonable. But I heard what she really meant: you challenged our control, and we can't let that stand. When she finished, she looked up, expecting me to plead or explain. Instead, I opened my binder slowly, the sound of paper crisp in the tense room. I laid out my evidence one sheet at a time, photos, time-stamped, showing the driveway's condition before and after. Then, printed excerpts from their own bylaws, highlighted in yellow. I didn't need to speak. I just turned the binder toward them and let them read. A murmur spread through the board members as they scanned the clauses I had marked. Section 4, Paragraph B, Section 9.2. Each citation dismantled their accusations piece by piece. Finally, I placed one more document on the table, my credentials from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. There was a visible shift in the room. A few members exchanged glances, others leaned forward. Even Mrs. Aldrich hesitated, her voice faltering for the first time. Still, she tried to recover. She accused me of undermining authority, of refusing to cooperate. Her tone sharpened, trying to turn the conversation away from evidence and back to emotion. But the damage was done. The more she spoke, the more defensive she sounded. I could see it in their faces, some of the board members were beginning to realize they'd gone too far. Then, I delivered the quietest blow of all. I slid a printed letter across the table, one I had sent earlier to the city's Public Works Department. It wasn't a complaint, it was an inquiry. I had asked whether HOA enforcement could override municipal property codes in cases of maintenance and safety. The city's response, stamped and signed, was simple: no. The room fell silent. I could feel the tension shifting. The HOA's authority, their absolute certainty, was unraveling in front of them. For the first time, Mrs. Aldrich didn't have a rule to hide behind. But I didn't gloat. I simply closed my binder and waited. They adjourned the session abruptly, claiming they needed to review the documentation. The audience, a handful of neighbors, lingered after the meeting, whispering. Some came up quietly to shake my hand. Others just gave a small nod, silent acknowledgments of quiet rebellion. When I walked out, the clouds had started to break. A thin ray of sunlight hit the gravel on my driveway as I returned home. It looked almost golden now, defiant and proud. But I knew better than to think it was over. Bureaucracies rarely admit defeat, they regroup. They change their language, their approach. And they had just tasted public embarrassment, the kind that festers into something darker. That evening, an email arrived, not from the HOA, but from an anonymous address. It contained a single sentence. "You've made this harder than it needed to be." No name. No signature. Just that. It didn't scare me. It confirmed everything. This wasn't about rules anymore, it was personal. The following days brought strange patterns. A few neighbors stopped waving. My trash pickup was mysteriously missed. Someone left a flyer under my door about community harmony. Subtle signs of quiet retaliation. But I'd seen worse, much worse. What they didn't understand was that every act of pettiness only made me stronger. Every attempt to pressure me only sharpened my resolve. I dealt with corrupt officers, war-zone politics, and logistical chaos in places where one mistake could cost lives. Compared to that, an HOA tantrum was child's play. I spent that week preparing my next move. I started documenting everything, every letter, every skipped trash day, every car that slowed too long in front of my house. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd build a record so clean it could stand in any courtroom. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Because while they were busy plotting new ways to make my life miserable, someone from their own board, quietly, anonymously, sent me something. A flash drive slipped into my mailbox one night, wrapped in plain paper. Inside it were files, meeting minutes, internal emails, even voice memos from their group chat. And buried inside that folder was a recording that would change everything. A recording from just 2 days before the inspection. Mrs. Aldrich's voice, cold and smug, saying, "He thinks he's smarter than us. Let's make an example of him." That was it. The proof of malice. Intent. They hadn't fined me for breaking a rule. They'd targeted me out of ego. And now, I had evidence. The retaliation they started had just backfired, and what came next would not only expose them but dismantle their power entirely. Because now, this wasn't just a story about gravel anymore. It was about justice. And I was done playing nice. The next HOA board meeting was announced with a nervous undertone that everyone in the neighborhood could feel. The usual confident tone of the circulars was gone, replaced by vague wording about addressing ongoing community concerns. For the first time, it didn't sound like a summons. It sounded like damage control. By now, whispers had spread across the block like dry leaves in the wind. The recording had changed everything. Only a handful of people knew about it, but that handful was enough. Someone inside the board had leaked it to me, and now it was in the hands of a man who knew exactly how to use it. I didn't rush. I didn't threaten. I waited. Because timing, I had learned long ago, was everything. The days before the meeting were strangely quiet. The same neighbors who once looked through me now avoided my eyes. Some, quietly supportive, left subtle signs, a thumbs up when no one was watching, a nod from across the street. Others looked nervous, afraid of being seen choosing a side. The HOA's control was cracking, not through confrontation, but exposure. Power built on fear doesn't collapse with force, it collapses with sunlight. On the morning of the showdown, I loaded my old military binder into my truck. Inside were all the documents, photographs, and now, the flash drive. The air was cold, crisp, and heavy with the kind of stillness that precedes something inevitable. When I reached the clubhouse, the parking lot was overflowing. Cars lined the street, neighbors crowded outside the glass doors. Whatever the board had planned tonight, it wasn't going to stay private. The community wanted a show, and whether the board liked it or not, they were going to get one. Inside, the usual order was gone. Conversations buzzed in low voices, papers rustled nervously, and the air felt charged. The board members sat at the front like uneasy monarchs watching their kingdom question them. Mrs. Aldridge, usually unshakable, looked pale. Her hands fidgeted with the corner of her notes. When the meeting began, the tension was almost visible. She cleared her throat, speaking into the microphone with forced composure. Tonight's meeting, she began, is to address ongoing concerns regarding property modifications and... But she didn't get to finish. A man from the crowd, one of my neighbors, usually quiet, stood up and asked loudly, "Are we going to talk about the recording?" A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Mrs. Aldridge froze. The microphone picked up the small tremor in her breathing. She tried to dismiss it. "We don't discuss private communications here," she said, her voice cracking slightly. But the crowd wasn't having it. Another resident spoke up, followed by another. "We all heard it," someone said. "You said you'd make an example of him." The room erupted into noise, not chaos, but collective realization. I didn't move yet. I watched. Timing was everything. Let the fire burn before you add fuel. When it finally quieted, I stood. Not angry, not dramatic, just steady. The kind of calm that makes people listen. I carried the binder to the front, placed it on the table in front of the board, and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I didn't come here to argue," I said, my tone level, deliberate. "I came here to finish this." Every eye in the room turned. The board looked like a row of statues. I opened the binder, flipped to the printed transcript of the HOA bylaws, and read aloud the exact clauses they had violated, their misuse of authority, their failure to follow due process, their harassment disguised as enforcement. Each word landed heavy in the silence. Then I reached for the small USB drive in my pocket. "This," I said, holding it up, "contains a recording of your president stating that I should be made an example of. That she would teach me a lesson for fixing my own driveway." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The board members looked at one another, some in shock, others in quiet guilt. Mrs. Aldridge's expression shifted from defiance to panic. "You can deny it," I continued, "but this drive also contains timestamped files, emails, and messages between board members. Someone on your own team thought the neighborhood deserved to know the truth." She tried to speak, her voice trembling, something about context, about misinterpretation. But her words fell flat. Because at that moment, the truth wasn't about law anymore. It was about trust. The residents, the very people who had once feared her, now turned on her with quiet fury. Questions poured in. How long had this gone on? How many others had been targeted? How much of the HOA's power had been built on manipulation? For years, the HOA had ruled with rules that no one dared to question. But now, the questions were endless. And as I watched the scene unfold, I realized something: I didn't need revenge. The truth was doing all the work. The board called for a recess, desperate to regroup. The members disappeared into a back room, their voices echoing faintly behind a thin wall. The crowd stayed, whispering, buzzing, alive with a new kind of energy. After 20 minutes, the door opened. The board returned, faces drawn, expressions defeated. Mrs. Aldridge didn't speak this time. The vice president, a man who had barely spoken before, took the microphone. His voice was flat, almost mechanical. "The board has decided to rescind all fines and enforcement actions regarding Mr. Carter's property." A pause. Then, even quieter. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Aldridge is stepping down as president." It was over. For a few seconds, there was silence, the kind that hangs just before something big happens. Then came applause. Not wild or dramatic, just genuine, relieved, grateful. The kind of sound that marks the end of a long tension. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just closed my binder, turned, and walked out of that room. Outside, the cold night air hit my face. The street was still filled with neighbors, some waiting, some filming on their phones, others just watching. When they saw me, they nodded, not as someone who won, but as someone who stood up. Back home, I parked by the same driveway that started it all. The gravel gleamed under the porch light, steady and unbroken. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. Not victory, peace. But deep down, I knew something important: HOAs don't vanish overnight. Power doesn't disappear, it adapts. There would be more paperwork, more letters, maybe new faces on the board. But what had changed wasn't just policy, it was perception. They knew now that someone could stand up to them. That their rules weren't divine. That fear wasn't permanent. I made myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the reflection of my driveway in the soft glow of the streetlight. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't regulation approved. But it was mine, built with my hands, my precision, my integrity. That night, the neighborhood slept differently. Some slept lighter, realizing they could fight back. Others slept restless, realizing their power had limits. As for me, I slept soundly for the first time in months. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because a few days later, something unexpected arrived in the mail. Not a letter from the HOA, but one from the city. It wasn't about fines. It was about recognition. They wanted to talk about my driveway. About how well it was built. About using it as a model for community drainage improvements. And that was when I realized, the fight that began with a fine was about to end with something much bigger. The days after the board meeting were oddly quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from recalibration. The HOA, stripped of its power figurehead, was in retreat mode. The community, meanwhile, buzzed in a strange mix of disbelief and awakening. For the first time, people weren't whispering behind closed doors. They were talking, openly, loudly, and without fear. But beneath the surface, something was building. Something bigger than a personal victory. 3 days after the meeting, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail. This time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was from the city's Department of Infrastructure and Public Works. The letter inside was short, formal, and shocking in its simplicity. Mr. Carter, your recent private driveway repair project has come to our attention through community reports and online footage. We'd like to discuss the engineering methods you employed, as they appear to exceed standard residential construction quality. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience. I read it twice. Then I laughed. The same project that had sparked fines, threats, and months of harassment had now drawn interest from city officials, not for violation, but admiration. When I called, the tone couldn't have been more different from the HOA's cold bureaucracy. The official on the other end spoke with genuine curiosity. He had seen pictures of my driveway circulating online after the board meeting. The precision, the water drainage alignment, the subbase compaction, all of it had apparently caught attention from professionals who recognized the level of expertise. He asked where I had learned such work, and when I told him about my years in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, there was a pause, the kind of pause that means respect. Mr. Carter, he finally said, we could use minds like yours. That one sentence changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Within a week, I found myself in a conference room downtown, surrounded by people half my age, staring at blueprints and municipal projects. They wanted me to consult, not as a contractor, but as a specialist for a local infrastructure rehabilitation initiative. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA fined me for gravel, and now the city wanted me to design roads. But while I was stepping into something new, the HOA's world was unraveling. The leaked recording had done more than expose misconduct. It had sparked an investigation. When residents started demanding access to meeting records and financial reports, the board's bookkeeping suddenly looked incomplete. Missing receipts, unexplained expenses, and maintenance budgets that never quite reached their intended destinations. Neighbors who once avoided conflict were now forming committees. Not HOA-controlled ones, independent ones. Transparency boards, neighborhood watch groups, even petitions to dissolve the HOA entirely. The empire was crumbling, and I didn't have to lift a finger. Local news caught wind of it next. Small-town outlets, always hungry for human interest drama, began running the story: Veterans Driveway Repair Exposes HOA Corruption. The headline spread faster than I expected. Within days, my phone lit up with messages from people across the country, homeowners, veterans, even ex-HOA members, thanking me for standing up. But fame wasn't what I wanted. I'd learned in the military that victory means little if you lose discipline. So I stayed quiet, careful, focused. Still, I couldn't deny it, the balance had shifted. Neighbors who once looked through me now stopped by to talk. They asked for advice on their driveways, gardens, drainage systems. Some even asked about how to challenge unjust fines. My front porch, once the symbol of defiance, had become a kind of local hub for change. Meanwhile, the new interim HOA president, a soft-spoken man named Greg, reached out. He wanted to make things right, or at least salvage what was left. When he visited, he didn't come with paperwork or threats. He came with coffee and honesty. He admitted what everyone already suspected: the board had become a personal power tool for a few people. The rest, including him, were too intimidated to speak up. When I showed him the evidence, he didn't defend anyone. He just sighed, tired, relieved, ready to rebuild. That was the difference between leadership and control. By the end of that month, the HOA had rescinded multiple unfair fines across the neighborhood. They voted to revise the bylaws, giving residents more decision power. And for the first time in years, the HOA wasn't something people feared. It was something they could actually participate in. But as peace returned, something unexpected happened, something almost poetic. One morning, a city truck pulled up in front of my house. The same street that once hosted HOA enforcers now hosted municipal engineers. They stepped out, clipboards in hand, and began taking measurements of my driveway. The lead engineer smiled. "Your drainage grading's flawless," he said. "You might have saved us thousands in research." A week later, the city council publicly announced that they were adopting the same gravel compaction and grading method I'd used, as part of a flood prevention program for residential streets. I didn't seek recognition. But when the mayor invited me to the next council meeting to thank me for my community contribution, I couldn't say no. Standing there, in front of cameras and microphones, I remembered where it all started: a fine for a driveway. A letter slipped under my door. A woman with a clipboard telling me I'd violated HOA standards. Now, those same standards were being rewritten, citywide, because one man refused to back down. The applause was polite but sincere. The city gave me a small plaque, nothing grand, but meaningful, in recognition of engineering excellence and community resilience. I took it home and placed it on my workbench beside an old army coin. That night, as I sat on my porch again, the neighborhood looked different. Not physically, but spiritually. There was laughter where tension used to hang. Lights glowed in windows that once stayed dim. People were living again. But even as I sat in peace, I knew the final chapter wasn't just about victory. It was about legacy. Because the story wasn't ending here, it was evolving. And sure enough, just as I started to think life was settling down, I got another letter. This time, from a neighboring town's homeowner association. They'd heard about me through the news. And they wanted help. Their HOA had turned abusive. Their board had silenced residents. Their fines had gone unchecked. They needed someone who understood both the system and how to fight it from within. I folded the letter slowly, set it down beside my coffee mug, and smiled. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was something else now. A quiet force against the kind of power that thought it could crush ordinary people. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a new battlefield. The morning sun stretched across my neighborhood like a warm promise, quiet, golden, unassuming. The kind of morning that hides its stories beneath ordinary light. For most people, it was just another day. But for me, it felt like the end of a long mission, and the beginning of a new one. Months had passed since that first fine, the one that started everything. The HOA that once ruled this neighborhood with intimidation had become almost unrecognizable. Meetings were open now, not behind closed doors. Fines were reviewed by committees of residents, not dictated by a single pen. People actually smiled when they saw each other. The tension had dissolved like frost in the sun. But the peace didn't mean the fight was forgotten. Every morning, as I walked past the gravel of my driveway, the same driveway that had caused so much chaos, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. It was purpose. Because that stretch of compacted stone had done more than fix a problem. It had started a movement. The letter from the neighboring town's HOA still sat on my workbench. They wanted my help, guidance on how to stand up, how to rebuild trust, how to fight injustice without tearing a community apart. I didn't reply immediately. I took time to think. I'd learned the hard way that wars aren't won by reacting, they're won by understanding what you're fighting for. When I finally called, the woman who answered sounded exhausted, like someone who had been fighting shadows for years. Her HOA, she said, had grown into something oppressive. Residents fined for mailbox paint. Warnings for planting flowers, not in color harmony. Even seniors ticketed for leaving their trash cans out an hour late. It was tyranny, dressed as order. And as I listened, I realized something chilling: this wasn't just one neighborhood's problem. This was everywhere. Across the country, small pockets of power had learned to control through rules, fines, and fear. And no one fought back, because no one thought they could. That night, I sat in my garage with the radio off and the old military blueprints of drainage and road systems laid out in front of me. I traced the lines with my finger, grids of control, systems of flow. Then it hit me. This wasn't about roads. It never was. It was about building systems, ones that worked for people, not against them. The same way I had learned to manage terrain and structure overseas, I could help people here rebuild the foundation of their communities. The next week, I drove 2 hours north to meet that other HOA community. The moment I arrived, the déjà vu hit me hard, the same prim lawns, the same beige fences, the same cold stares of suspicion from behind blinds. The air itself felt heavy with unspoken rules. But underneath, I saw the same thing I had once felt, quiet anger, buried beneath fear. We met in a small community center, 10 residents sitting in folding chairs, their eyes carrying a mix of exhaustion and hope. I didn't bring charts or lectures. I brought my story. I told them everything, the fine, the threats, the board meeting, the exposure, and the quiet victory that followed. Not as a speech, but as a confession. And by the time I finished, the room was silent, not because they didn't believe me, but because they finally saw what was possible. I didn't tell them to fight. I told them to build. To document every interaction. To learn their own bylaws better than the board. To attend every meeting, record every minute, expose every misuse of power, not through chaos, but through precision. Just like in engineering, precision wins where brute force fails. Months passed, and one by one, I visited more communities, small towns, gated developments, suburban sprawls. Each with its own story of control, each repeating the same pattern: silence, fear, submission. But every time I shared mine, something changed. People started recording their own meetings. They filed proper reports. They replaced corrupt members with honest ones. Slowly, a quiet resistance began, not of violence, but of truth. Word spread. Before long, journalists started calling. Homeowner forums online began sharing my story under a new phrase, the Carter method. They called me a HOA reformer. Some even called me the road builder. I never asked for that title. But I accepted it, because it wasn't really about me, it was about the idea that no one, no matter how small, had to stay silent under unfair authority. Back home, the changes in my own neighborhood continued. Greg, the interim president, turned out to be one of the best leaders we'd had. The HOA's website now included open access financials, voting polls, and a feedback board. Transparency had become the new normal. One evening, as I was watering the small garden by my porch, Greg stopped by with his son. He handed me an envelope, official, but warm in tone. It was an invitation. In recognition of your contribution to rebuilding community trust, the city is establishing a Carter Community Initiative, a volunteer program pairing veterans with local neighborhood projects. I stood there quietly for a moment, holding the letter, feeling the weight of everything it represented. From a $250 fine for gravel, to a city program built on the principles I once defended overseas. Sometimes life doesn't reward you with applause. It rewards you with purpose. That night, I sat on my porch again, the air cool, the sky deep blue with the kind of silence that holds peace instead of fear. My driveway stretched out before me, glowing faintly under the porch light, the same gravel, the same pattern, but now a symbol of resilience. Across the street, a group of kids rode their bikes, their laughter echoing down the lane. No one yelled about rule violations anymore. The world felt lighter. And as I watched, I realized something simple but profound: legacy isn't what you build with your hands. It's what you leave in others. The fight against unfair HOAs wasn't over. It probably never would be. Power has a way of hiding in new forms. But so does strength. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, document, and speak the truth, there would always be hope. I finished my coffee, leaned back, and let out a long breath. The story that began with gravel had ended with something far more solid: unity. Tomorrow, I'd drive out to another town. Another neighborhood. Another group of people who didn't yet believe they could win. And when they asked me who I was, I'd tell them what I tell everyone now. I'm just a guy who built a driveway, and learned that sometimes, the smallest repairs can rebuild entire communities. The porch light flickered softly. The wind carried the faint hum of distant crickets. Somewhere, a door closed. The world was calm again. But beneath that calm, I could feel something steady, enduring, the quiet legacy of standing firm when everyone else bowed. And as I looked at that familiar path of gravel, shining faintly under the moon, I smiled. Because in the end, it wasn't just a driveway. It was a road that led me, and hundreds of others, back to freedom.